Mm. All right, so we are now live. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm here with Dr. Pete Burnap. Jamie is trying to install plugins right now because Google Chrome does not make it easy. So we thought we'd kick off, and then Jamie's going to join us when he can. So Pete, before we start, I was wondering if you can give us a quick introduction as to what kind of work you do, and yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So yeah, I'm Pete Burnap. I'm a lecturer at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at Cardiff University. In this context, I am a researcher in social computing, interested in kind of understanding the social interactions and social processes online. We have a current project funded by the ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, looking at particularly at hate speech and how hate speech propagates online. So we're looking at a number of cases. We recently published a paper on how hate speech spread following the murder of drummer Lee Rigby in Woolwich. So we've made some interesting findings in that area. We're also looking at sexist and homophobic, disableist comments on Twitter in particular, and how they spread. What are the factors that lead to the spread, and flip side of that, how it's kind of inhibited and how it's managed and stemmed within the Twitter community.
Fascinating. All right, so let's dive straight in and talk about some of the factors that you found within hate speech, specifically in Twitter, because that's one of the components, I think, of trolling is when people sort of try to aggravate others, either intentionally or just because they're expressing their views in quite a flippant or strong manner. Can you tell us a bit about those factors?
Well, I mean, the factors we found were, well, with the headline finding, I guess, of the paper we did around Woolwich, was that hate speech wasn't propagating that far. And in fact, it was largely, it only received a handful of retweets. Which I guess is our measure, if you like, of propagation and spread. What we found was actually messages of support for the victim, and indeed, the wider community. So the target community, if you like, in this case, was the Muslim community, and the support from a range of different communities for that particular community was spread a lot more than the anti-Muslim and hate speech, and included in that the trolling type content. So it was quite interesting to see that. In terms of the factors, that like the content factors, it was interesting to see that a lot of people were trying to tie their comments to the event. So they were using things like hashtags, hashtag Woolwich and so on. And we saw that it was much more likely that tweets would be retweeted and spread if they included a hashtag. But one of the most significant factors was actually the inclusion of a URL. So
interesting.
What we found was that people were providing evidence to back up their claims. So whether it was hateful or not hateful, whether it was trolling or not trolling, the inclusion of a URL as evidence for that was propagated more. So it seems that people are looking for additional evidence before they spread things on Twitter.
So almost citizen journalism.
So yeah, that was pretty interesting to see as well. We're currently looking at some of the other cases. What we're finding actually is within Twitter, there is a lot less hate speech than we would expect. The Woolwich case led us to collect a lot more. Whether that was because of the nature of the event or not, I'm not sure. But it's not as large as you would expect, and that we found that quite interesting as well.
So that's a really lovely prelude to sort of this conversation.
Good still there while Jamie fixes his technical problems as he's online now.
Hi Jamie, how are you doing?
Hello. Good. Sorry about that.
That's quite all right. So then we've just had a little introduction as to some of the research that Dr. Pete Burnap has been doing, and I wondered if you could give a quick introduction as to who you are and just a bit more about that.
Yeah, so I run a centre at the think tank Demos called Centre for the Analysis of Social Media. Some of the work's actually similar to Pete's insofar as we are interested in collecting and analysing social media data sets, especially insofar as it can be used as a good source of sort of research work into understanding society and social attitudes and public belief and so on. just fascinated really in the way in which social media has become an important and interesting new public sphere, and trying to understand what that means. And then alongside that, I've just recently published a book called The Dark Net, which is about some of the darker, hidden internet subcultures that maybe we don't see quite as much, and that includes trolling, internet trolls, and cyberbullying. So quite an interesting mix of things, and hopefully relevant for today.
So we were talking a little bit about factors that that we can find in terms of how people exchange information online, specifically in Twitter. Let's move a little bit away from Twitter. What are some of the reasons that people might troll or post inflammatory content? And maybe actually before we get to that point, how are we going to define trolling for the purposes of this discussion? Because there's a lot of different definitions out there.
Well, I can give it a go. Let's start with the definition of the word troll, which I think is widely misunderstood. Everybody assumes that it refers to some kind of sort of hunched over Nordic cave dweller, maybe living underneath a bridge, perhaps. Looks a bit like me, potentially.
You're not very troll-like. Impish.
Impish, right, okay. But that's not actually the etymology of the word. It comes from Usenet groups in the early 90s, which were sort of pre-runners of chat rooms, Yahoo chat rooms, where lots of people used to go and chat about all manner of different things, pretty raucous, pretty uncensored. Usenet groups, particularly a hierarchy of Usenet groups that were known as alt, short for alternative. And in the early 90s, a lot of newcomers joined Usenet for the first time. This was the sort of the first golden age of the net, where people en masse joined. AOL offered access to Usenet, and suddenly millions of people were joining what had before then been quite a sort of reserved academic-y, technical computer science space. And those that were already using Usenet were actually a bit aggrieved that all these newcomers had turned up. And so they started playing a game, which was they called to troll for newbies, for newcomers. And it comes from a fishing term, to drag a baited line across the surface of some water and see what bites. It comes from fishing. And the idea was to post a sort of a quite funny urban myth, a legend from the group that only the newcomers would respond to, because they wouldn't know this was a joke. And then the minute they were sort of exposed as a newcomer, they would be relentlessly sort of laughed at, abused as being an idiot, a newbie, a moron. And that's where it came from. It was a way of sort of trying to distinguish newcomers from the old guard. And as a result, trolling was often quite funny. It was often quite creative, quite skillful in the way that it would find these newcomers. And yeah, sure, be nasty to them, be mean to them, but it was always really just relatively light-hearted. And it was always, what happened on Usenet, the expression went, stayed on Usenet. Let's not try and ruin somebody's real life. Let's be nasty and mean and funny and aggressive online, but that's where it ends. And in the last 10 years or so, it feels like trolling has taken on something of a different meaning. It's more just brute nastiness, just mean, mindless, threatening and abusive language to complete strangers online. So you've actually got two definitions. You've got the sort of purists like me who think of it actually as a very old, established culture, in some cases can actually do some good. And then you've got the way that most newspapers refer to it, which is nothing more than idiots with a hard drive slagging anybody off they can think of. So it's over to you. What do you think the correct definition is? Because I actually think it's quite confusing. It's not always clear when one stops and where the other starts, but it's definitely more than just being nasty to strangers.
Well, I think for the purposes of this conversation, especially looking at the psychology behind what's happened in recent events, so with Caroline Criado Perez and Mary Beard, and then the most recent issue with Brenda Leyland, let's talk a bit about the latter definition. So Pete, can you tell us a bit about why people might be cruel just for the sake of it, as opposed to, for the older version, the more purist definition of kind of trolling for newbies, for instance?
Well, I mean, you know, like I say, I'm not a psychologist, but from looking at the types of content you see online, it does. Look, half of it seems to be looking for attention, looking for a reaction, essentially. You know, which I guess is going back to the more traditional sense of the word. You know, hanging the bait out there and seeing who bites. But then there's another half of the community that actually is just plain nasty. They're more doing it as a kind of a flippant response rather than anything targeted and expecting a kind of response back. It just seems to be very, very harsh, aggressive. The Criado Perez case is a perfect example of that, where, you know, the comments there were very explicit, you know, kind of violent and really nasty in their nature. And yeah, I agree with Jamie to some extent. I wouldn't necessarily say that was the traditional definition of the word troll, but I guess, you know, now we move into kind of more highly interactive and scaled social networks, things like Twitter, Facebook, and so on. So maybe the word needs to be kind of redefined somewhat to be brought into line with the current social context. So it does seem to be used more in the mass media, as people, you know, Jamie's term of just idiots with a hard drive. There is a lot of that on there, but the old stuff still exists. You know, people seem to be on there. You can see their timeline, and you look at it over a period of days, weeks, months, and you've got consistent attention grabbing, always contacting people like celebrities, people in the media, people who are topical at this moment in time, just dangling bait, waiting for them to respond. Sometimes they bite, sometimes they don't, but when they do bite, and you see this goes on and on and on over time. So there's two schools, you know, there's the old school type, which is doing it for attention and engagement, and there's the other type, which seems to be very targeted, aggressive, and antagonistic, perhaps is more the appropriate word. But that, in my experience of looking at the data, that is.
There seems to be an unrelenting aspect to it as well, that people who do, once they've acquired their target, whichever camp we're looking at, they then absolutely dogmatically pursue the individual or individuals in question. And I know that in some research that's been done on trolling, I think probably in the latter camp, that they found that people who troll persistently are much more likely to display what's called sort of noxious personality traits. So traits that impair one's ability to build relationships and function in a sort of pro-social way. So things like Machiavellianism, which is being impulsive and charming, psychopathic, so cold, fearless, and antisocial. I am simplifying here, and also sadistic. And another thing that I think was interesting last week when I was chatting about this with Dr. Aaron Bellick was he was saying that many of the people who are active in this particular respect online tend to be male, and we have been asked a couple of questions around what the gender disparity is in terms of people who are subject to trolling. And he posited that it might be that because in a general normal population there's a higher percentage of males who have things like antisocial personality disorders, that they're disproportionately represented, and therefore that's why they're more of those who perpetrate trolling. What are you? Oh, can you hear me?
I'm getting a pretty slow connection here.
Yeah, we're a bit jumpy then.
It seems to have come back a little. I think it might be at your end, Natalie, because I can see Pete okay, but I'll answer anyway with that one. The first thing is that there is something of a sort of strange herd mentality, a group mentality, when somebody responds to this bait. You have this strange one-upmanship where trolls sort of are constantly trying to outdo each other to be more and more outrageous, more and more aggressive. And this sort of strange dynamic, I think, is also what takes people to saying things actually that they really don't mean. They're not really thinking about it. They're just trying to outdo the next person in how incredibly nasty they can be online. Now, in terms of who the perpetrators and the targets are, I think there's a misconception here that it's a male-only problem. In terms of who is the target of trolling, some research that we did looking at celebrities that are trolled found that even when you normalise per sort of 1,000 tweets, celebrity men are trolled more often than celebrity women, whether that's journalism or members of parliament or sort of celebrities. We sort of call this partly we call this the Piers Morgan effect, though, because I think Piers Morgan really heavily skewed our data because he is trolled more than anybody in the history of Twitter. But I looked at the other day, just before doing this, I looked at the some of the data from the National Crime Survey stuff, and it seems to suggest, I need to spend a bit more time on it, seems to suggest that men are reporting being trolled, being the victim of online sort of abuse, more than women. Only about a very small amount. We're talking 1% of people, 2% of people, but more than women say they're getting trolled by strangers. So I'm not sure that it is quite as simple as men targeting women. I think there's probably more at play than that. And we've seen in recent months some high-profile internet trolls that have been outed or have been arrested and convicted have indeed been women.
So why do you think this is? Why are we seeing perhaps the rise in female trolls, or were they always there but just more anonymous?
Yeah, well, because I see internet trolling today as being analogous to screaming and shouting at a television screen. There's celebrities on the TV that seem to occupy a different plane of existence to the rest of us. It's fair game that they get targeted, and it doesn't feel like you're ever really interacting with them, you're just venting at them. And in my experience, men and women pretty much scream at the television about the same. So if that's a fair analogy, Pete, I'm not sure if Pete agrees, but if that's a fair analogy.
Yeah. I'm just trying to think of my own household. Yeah, I think it probably is. Yeah. Yeah, but I think the other thing is, so that from our own research, you know, generally it's a topic or an event that leads to trolling. You know, so it depends who's then involved in the event. So you know, in the case of you know, a particular celebrity, then of course it's that celebrity that would take the brunt of the you know, of the interaction. And if there's an event, then it's normally the actors involved in that event that take the brunt of the action. And then, you know, I agree. I don't think there's any real difference in the likelihood of males or females to respond. From the data I've looked at. However, it does depend on how likely it is to hit the male or female nerve, I suppose. You know, the likely response, I think, is proportional to how relevant it will be to male or female communities. Sometimes it will be split pretty even. You know, sometimes it'll touch on male communities, sometimes on female communities more than others. But no, I agree with Jamie on the point of the balance. I mean, if you look at the Criada Perez case, you know, there's two people who are high-profile cases that were prosecuted and sent to prison. One was male, one was female. So you know, that was a pretty bad case.
Yeah, and the one difference that I've seen, sort of more anecdotal maybe than some of Pete's more rigorous research, is the type of abuse is slightly different. So, you know, in my experience, women tend to get abuse which is more about their looks or their appearance and rape threats and sort of threats of a sexual nature, whereas men tend to be abused on a sort of a wider variety of different things, often just really angry, abusive name calling, essentially. Yeah. So it might be that there is also a slightly different type of abuse that women receive than men, and maybe it is more serious, but in terms of volume, I don't think there's much of a difference.
Fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about some of the ways in which trolls have been dealt with recently. So we're seeing that some people, when it's taken to extreme, actually get arrested for it, or they get unmasked, and then suddenly everything collapses and the anonymity is shared, and then it has, well, significant impact and repercussions to that person's life and everyone else around them. What do you think are the options available to us in how we deal with people who are trolling others?
Well, oh, okay. So I'll start on in terms of the the ideal, I guess, which is self-management, self-regulation within the community. Like I said, the research we've done on this one case suggests that the Twitter community themselves either drown out this kind of trolling behaviour with messages of positivity, or more positive messages, or more constructive messages. They also, tend not to propagate that type of information, and it ends up being kind of a whisper in all the noise. But there's also the element of counter speech as well. So we've seen there are a number of Twitter pages where people are actively retweeting things that are sexist, homophobic, racist, in order to make a point of the fact that it is. And what you'll see there is that people engage with this, and there's elements of calls to reason. You can't do this, you shouldn't be doing this. Calls to social norms, is totally unacceptable. There's also just kind of, I guess, rebuttal. Give me some evidence for why that is actually true or not. If people are being homophobic or racist or whatever. And there's also elements of kind of just outing people, saying that's pathetic, ridiculous, it's racist, that's sexist, and that kind of thing, which does tend to stem it. Once people have got that response, they've got maybe the response they were looking for, which was acknowledgement of what they were trying to do, and then they stop. However, there's a flip side to that, which is that sometimes you get antagonistic responses, saying, "Oh, you're a keyboard warrior," or you're a coward or whatever for saying this stuff online. Go and say that to someone's face or whatever. That then tends to lead to further and more extreme trolling. People then start to get really nasty when they get that. They're happy being called a racist, they're happy being called sexist, but when you call them a coward and a keyboard warrior, they don't like that, and all of a sudden it starts getting really, really nasty. So there's the two sides to it. It can be kind of self-managed, but in a way that has to be of a certain type, because if you go the other way and start getting antagonistic in your management, then it gets worse. So that's within the community kind of management. So I don't know, maybe Jamie's got a comment on that.
Yeah, Natalie, what worries me is the danger of over-regulating and over-censoring ourselves, and feeling like we can't be nasty, we can't be offensive. It's vital that we're allowed to be offensive to each other. Trolls probably are at the very extremities of how far that can be pushed, but as a general principle, it's extremely important that we can be nasty to each other in society. That pulls us up. I mean, that's part of what free expression depends upon. And so I often think about being the target of internet trolling. Now, it's a two-way thing, because I think trolls will often say things and not really think about the effect that it might have on the person that's receiving it. So they think it's just a throwaway comment, it's being nasty, no one's going to take it seriously. Of course, when you receive it, that's not how it feels at all. But occasionally, I think when communication comes from somebody whose face you can't see and who is nameless and you don't know who it is, you can often overreact and take it far more personally as well, and you probably should. You get more offended, more upset. You subscribe to people perhaps more nasty motivations than they had ever intended. And I think, I'm sorry to say, I know it sounds a little bit callous, but I think part of it is that we have to toughen up. We live in a society now in which everybody can communicate with everybody at any time. And if we're willing to live publicly and share stuff about ourselves, we have to accept that part of the cost of doing that is going to be other people being nasty to us. And we have to learn to accept that that is the case, not overreact. Yeah, of course there's times when you're being really mean and abusive and like directly threatening that you just can't live it. You've got to report it to the social platform, and they're actually pretty good when it comes to investigating some of this, or even to the police. But for the nasty and the offensive, I think we've just got to be able to, we've got to start realising that's part of life online. It always has been, and unfortunately it always will be. But maybe there's a good side to that, which is that we also toughen up. We also embrace free expression. We're also willing to speak our mind, because there is no greater danger to free speech than self-censoring for fear of offending other people. And if we start doing that too much, then I'm afraid free expression in this society, in this country, is going to slowly wither away, and I definitely don't want that. And if the cost of not having that is some trolls on the internet pissing a few people off, that's a price I'm willing to pay.
Yeah, it's that whole adage of we all have the equal right to be equally offended, and I think that's a good rule to live by. So I suppose really it's about how one frames what it is that's happening when it goes on. So you were saying earlier about taking it to heart in more of a personal way than perhaps is intended, because often these comments are made flippantly, and it really isn't about the person to whom the stuff is targeted, because what you're saying, the fact that we can all communicate with one another online, we can, but we also are communicating with a public persona of the people that we have projected ourselves to be online. And so any attack that you're going to get, unless that person knows you personally, is going to be filtered through all sorts of levels of stuff. So for the person who's doing the trolling, they've perceived you in a particular way, or they're just trying to get some kind of anger or fear or whatever base response across. And so maybe a lot of it is about contextualizing that behavior and realizing that it's not as personal, and then allowing the more extreme behaviors to be taken or dealt with offline. So when it does become an actual threat, I suppose the question is, when do you make that decision? Like, at which point?
Yeah, and that's you're right. That is the correct question to ask, and I don't have a precise and easy answer for you, but I think that's a more sensible and thoughtful way of thinking about this, rather than just, there's people being nasty on the internet and what we're going to do about it. Like, at what point is it just offensive and we live with it and it's part of life online, and at what point does it cross over and it's something where you need to stop it, you need to shut it down somehow? And I've seen people who have been trolled, particularly on sites like 4chan or Reddit. Twitter trolling on the whole can be nasty, but there's much worse stuff going on other sites where people's entire identity is shared with complete strangers online. They get abusive phone calls. I've seen cases where women who share naked photos of themselves are then immediately identified, and those pictures are screen grabbed, saved. They then identify the person, and it's like a group trolling. They then identify that person's family and friends on Facebook and Twitter, and then send them all the naked photos. And I've witnessed that stuff happening. Now that is way beyond offensive. That is trying to ruin someone's life. It's sharing pictures that they've taken without their permission. That is sharing private information about them without their permission. That's the line to me. I mean, the minute you start doing stuff like that, where you're essentially breaking the law in what it is that you're doing, that's not trolling anymore. That's just bullying. That's just doing stuff that's illegal offline, online. There's not really any great difference to it.
What are your thoughts about that, Pete?
Yeah, I was just kind of reflecting on the Jamie's comments there. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I agree with it. I think, yes, there is an element of you put yourself in the general online public domain when you go onto social media and the web and so on and interact with people. But I don't know. I'm not entirely sure we should be expected to get used to kind of nastiness. There's different types of people. I guess some people can learn to live with it and toughen up and so on. But other people wouldn't react well at all to that. I don't think they can be expected to just take, even if it is flippant and not particularly nasty. I think they're online to do whatever they are to do, but that could be to promote something fairly chilled out, relaxed, and not at all politically or anything else motivated. And all of a sudden they could start receiving abuse or whatever, some particular reason, your product's rubbish or you look funny or whatever. And I just don't think that's fair. I think you wouldn't expect that in normal society. I know online's different because it's opened up to a wider public. But if I was standing on the steps of my door and someone walked past and said, you got a stupid haircut or whatever, I don't think I'd accept that. I don't think I'd be.
I mean, Pete, I'm afraid that sort of thing does happen to me with my hair relatively often, and so you do begin to learn to live with it. I'm not saying I'm happy about it. I'm not. I'm overjoyed that it's the case. It's more like it is a reality of how we we live, and we do have to sort of learn to live with it, even if we're not particularly content or happy about it. I mean, it's like the greatest trolls in the UK, the internet trolls, the sort of the proper internet trolls, would say that the greatest trolls are Chris Morris, the satirical British comedy writer, and Stephen Colbert, the American TV shows who they do, what they do is brilliantly mock hypocritical public figures, especially politicians. That stuff's the lifeblood of our democracy. I think it's really important to keep it. And I think what I'm trying to say is that we're all becoming like mini celebrities. We're all we're all public in some way. And I think if my articles, for example, are getting abused and people are moaning and complaining and saying I'm a rubbish writer and it's useless and terrible, fine. And I get that a lot.
I was just going to say, it sounds like the last sort of peer reviews there. Yeah. But no, I think that's one. Yeah, I guess that's fine, you know, and you can accept that, and you know, that's fine. But not everyone can, you know. I think people are online for a range of different purposes, and while some people are willing to take it and learn to live with it, other people aren't. And I don't think it's fair that they should have to. You could say, yeah, we need to soften up a bit, and it's part of society, but I don't know. I'm not entirely sure I'm happy with that. I think people deserve an element of respect online as well as offline. You wouldn't be able to walk up. Well, you could walk up to people and say nasty stuff, and yeah, you could say you get used to it and you don't like it, but I learned to live with it. I'm just not entirely sure I'm happy with that. I don't think we should have to. But saying that, I don't think we can manage that easily. You know, you certainly can't go around, and the last thing I'd ever want to do is restrict any sort of free speech. But you know, the interaction between one or two or more people is something that's a kind of a cultural and social norm. There are norms of expected personal behaviour in actual reality, and I don't see why that should change in the online environment. I think it should be accepted norms that shouldn't be too far away from the real world.
Well, I suppose the question here is how do we? It comes down to values, really. So we value being able to protect those who are most vulnerable in society, who can't grow thicker skins, who are more sensitive, perhaps people who are young or people who can't tolerate that kind of level of attack. And then on the other side, it's a question of, well, yes, but our democracies are based on free speech, and that was what the web was invented for, was for collaborative information sharing, free of any kind of sort of centralized governance or power. If we look at sort of the open infrastructure network that originated, that it was based on. So I wonder if I've got this sort of odd idea thinking about 4chan, if you could end up with trolling groups where that lass on 4chan who's had her life kind of opened up and torn apart and can go to a group and go, right, these trolls have completely effed up my life. Can we troll them back? Well, maybe that's a bit too much eye for an eye and you end up in turf wars, but there's got to be something that people can do, some recourse of action that both allows us to encourage freedom of speech, not to diminish it in any respect, but also gives us a way of handling this if we can't do so by ourselves and we don't want to take it offline to the police or what have you if it's not that severe.
Well, I've seen plenty of people trolling the trolls. I mean, that is itself a bit of an internet culture, and I've seen people who call themselves virtuous trolls or virtue trolls going around trying to find nasty people online and working out ways of really pissing them off too.
Does it work?
It's really hard to know, actually, because you've got you knowing who's the troll and who's the victim. I mean, it gets very confusing. And but I feel like I know it does sound rather nasty and mean, but part of beating the trolls is to not respond, to not rise to them, to not get angered by them, to not respond, to not feed the trolls, as it was always said. And so part of not feeding the trolls is learning to toughen up in the sense that you don't respond to it and you let it go. Now, there are obviously, like I said before, there's a line where it's like, this is just too much. And I think as long as the social media platforms do make it easy to report stuff and police are there if there's serious investigations to be made, because the police at the moment are overwhelmed by complaints about cyberbullying on Facebook and they don't know what to do about it, because they could literally spend all of their time and resources investigating every single complaint people are making. Oh, this person's been nasty to me on Facebook. So there's there's something I think that we need to do to make sure that the social media platforms and the police do have the resources to investigate those serious cases. But part of it, like I said, I still think that ignoring them is usually, not always, but usually the best way of dealing with them. And if you're feeling adventurous and brave and you want to create a band of vigilante trolls, yes, you'll probably enjoy it as well, because it can be quite an exciting thing to do, and I've seen it, and it can work, and it can upset them too. But you've got to be pretty thick-skinned to be able to do that, believe me, because it can get really, really quite aggressive and nasty out there.
Definitely not my bag.
My advice is you don't want to end up in a war against 4chan trolls or Reddit trolls, because you probably aren't going to win.
Well, there we go. So, okay, so I think we've covered a lot of bases, and maybe we can start wrapping this up. I was wondering if you've got anything that you want to mention or touch on or discuss that we haven't yet looked at. Let me turn this over to Pete first of all.
Well, I guess the future direction is my particular interest. Then is how this is going to be how this is going to evolve in terms of management online, because it's never going to be policed. You can't have a Twitter police or social media police. You wouldn't want it. It would be not good. It would constrain free speech, and that's the last thing you want. You'd be drawing lines in the sand here, there, and everywhere, and that would be a nightmare. But I would like to see over the next few years how people begin to create their own kind of responses, and whether the cultural norms of just mean and malicious and antagonistic behavior manifests itself in Twitter, and whether you can see generalizable models and methods for countering it, and like you say, roping the trolls in a bit, and trying to kind of put them in their place to some extent. And I'm just generally interested to see how this plays out over the next few years.
Cool. And Jamie, what about you?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with Pete that it's going to be really interesting to see, especially how, given we've had more sort of police investigations and unmasking of trolls, how that affects behaviour, because I think it obviously will, and it will change the way that what people think they can do online. Only really the broader trends, the growth of sort of privacy and anonymity and the concerns people have about that, and the increase in freely available software to guard your anonymity and your freedom online. Whether the fact that sort of basic infrastructure of how people are going to browse the net, particularly using anonymous browsers, might change behaviour in the other way. So it might actually mean that people feel they're even less accountable for their actions, because they can stay anonymous more easily than maybe they could have done 5 years ago. And so you might just have this sort of tension where there are some people that are really worried that all these arrest prosecutions make it harder to troll, but then other things running against that, where you can stay anonymous online far more easily now, and that makes you more likely to troll. So I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out, but that's the thing I'm keeping an eye on.
Well, I think whichever ways and directions it ends up going, it's going to be an interesting thing to keep an eye out for. So we should probably have another chat like this in a year's time and see what's changed. If anyone online who's watching this has any questions about trolling, you can tweet any of us. I'm at the website, Pete is at pbfeed, and Jamie is at Jamie J. Bartlett. So tweet to us if you have any questions, and I'll post this up on my website and probably on the chat's websites as well. Thanks, guys, for coming online, and speak with you guys soon. Cheers.
Yeah. See you later.
Bye.
Bye-bye.